Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to Level-Headed News. This is your host, Brenda. I have a special edition for you with 3 articles that I thought were pretty important to get out. This mess that's going on with this soft coup business needs to have a lot of attention put on it, and it needs to be squelched. The quicker the better. All 3 of these articles are off of Natural News, and all 3 of the URLs are in the description of this video if you'd like to take a further look at more information on these. I'll go ahead and read them to you. The first one is entitled Treason, Left-Wing Media Attempting a Soft Coup in America by Hyperventilating Over Self-Contrived Russian Conspiracy Fabrication. It is now clear that the coordinated media propaganda campaign to falsify delusional accusations about Russia influencing the U.S. election has a specific political purpose: to pressure electoral voters to dump Donald Trump before December the 19th, the day electoral votes are cast. Across the entire left-wing media, which now teeters on the verge of clinical mental illness, you are witnessing a coordinated, timed, strategic assault on America, democracy, and freedom itself. The Washington Post has been leading this charge by fabricating conspiratorial accusations out of thin air, failing to name even a single source to back up their deranged assertion. Now, the left-wing media is passing out tinfoil hats to everyone in sight and telling them to start hyperventilating about Russian defeated Hillary narrative until it has consensus reaching among them all. When a sufficient number of delusional leftists achieve a uniform hallucination that blames Hillary Clinton's defeat on someone other than Hillary Clinton, the shared hallucination is then deemed as fact. So far, the fabricated lie that claims the Russian defeated Hillary Clinton in the election has been repeated by Paul Krugman, Nate Silver, Keith Olbermann, Democratic Congressman David Cicilline, Michael Moore, and a seemingly endless list of obedient Clinton-worshipping propagandists working to try to overthrow democracy in America. If the electoral votes are stolen on December the 19th, it could unleash civil war across America. What these delusional, mentally ill left-wingers don't seem to realize is that when it comes to election outcomes and electoral voters, they are playing with fire. Trump supporters will not stand idly by and allow their nation to be stolen from them by a bunch of delusional crybaby Juro terrorists who still can't understand that Hillary lost primarily because she's horribly corrupt and deeply unlikable person. No, they have to blame something else. James Comey, the Russians, the Loch Ness Monster, or maybe even gray aliens from planet Zorg. In their minds, Clinton could not have legitimately lost because they worship Clinton as a cult figure. To left-wing media accolades, the Clinton campaign was synonymous with the Clinton cult. Inside the cult, obedience to Hillary Clinton is a religious test, not a rational conclusion based on evidence or facts. Thus, in their twisted minds, she cannot be defeated by any legitimate means. Somebody must have faked something, they concluded, without a shred of supporting evidence, of course. This is precisely why the defeat of Clinton does not compute in their echo chamber skulls. Now they're lashing out with every conspiratorial tinfoil hat inspired theory they can drum up, hoping something will sway a sufficient number of electoral voters to ditch Trump and throw the election towards chaos. 10 radical ways the lawless left is still planning to put Hillary Clinton into the White House. I predicted all this, by the way, in a November 27th article entitled She's Back, 10 Radical Ways the Lawless Left is Planning to Put Hillary Back into the White House on January the 20th. In that article, I outlined the top 10 ways the delusional Democrats could plot to deny Donald Trump the White House. When I first published this list, many people thought such scenarios sounded bonkers. But now, after watching the Washington Post literally fabricate entire articles claiming Russia stole the election, none of this seems far-fetched anymore, does it? For your convenience, I've listed all 10 of them here. Number 1, steal the electoral votes. Number 2, plunge America into chaos and declare martial law. Number 3, crash the markets back to the dark ages and destroy continuity of government. Number 4, launch an EMP nuclear assault on America and blame the Russians. Number 5, provoke nuclear war with Russia. Number 6, assassinate Trump and threaten Pence until he complies. Number 7, open the floodgates for illegals and overrun the country with militant foreigners. Number 8, activate a massive false flag event in a large U.S. city, possibly targeting Trump Tower. Number 9, a popular uprising to occupy Washington, D.C. on January the 20th, 2017. And scenario 10, poison pill, America the week before the inauguration. The radical left-wing media is playing a dangerous game, and it just might blow up in their faces. What you're witnessing being rolled out by the radical left-wing media is a desperate and dangerous gamble. If they achieve success and somehow manage to flip enough votes to name Hillary Clinton America's new president, they unleash an almost immediate civil war and likely military coup against the hopelessly corrupt Obama regime and its lapdog-lying media, which exists now as nothing but pure state-run propaganda. Make no mistake that armed American citizens, police officers, and military personnel nationwide will have no hesitation in rising up against the attempted coup and defending their republic by making sure Donald Trump is sworn into office. There is no circumstance under which people who voted for Trump just lie down and allow their country to be stolen from them by delusional leftists who quite obviously need to be locked up in a psychiatric ward. If the left-wing media soft coup attempt fails, by the way, their credibility implodes with their electoral defeat, and the entire left-wing media goes down in history as a laughably pathetic failed propaganda apparatus that tried to steal an election but failed. Many observers, including Michael Savage and myself, have called for criminal investigations into the un-American activities of left-wing propagandists who pose as journalists. If anyone is actually working with the Russians right now, it's the commie-loving left-wing journo terrorists who practically fell over themselves to applaud Fidel Castro, a murderous destroyer of life and liberty. I see a likely outcome in all this where the left-wing media, much like the Democratic Party itself, collapses under the weight of its own unbearable lies and lunatic conspiracy theories. I wouldn't even be surprised if some of the more extreme anti-American journalists or journo terrorists end up indicted and imprisoned for actively plotting to undermine a legitimate U.S. government. Prepare for possible Second Amendment activation. During an interview a few weeks back, a Washington Post reporter asked me, "Should we increase our security around here? Are we going to be safe?" My updated answer is, you're really not wise to keep playing with fire by fabricating false stories intended to overthrow the electoral process of our republic. You're quite likely, in fact, to set off a bloody civil war that you cannot control. These are dangerous times, my friend. An unhinged political left has decided to go for broke to overthrow the democratic process that has driven the peaceful transition of power from president to president for the last 240 years. At this moment in history, the political left has essentially asserted that they demand a one-party state forever run by liberals, and they no longer accept the result of fair and free elections unless those results favor their candidates. I repeat that last phrase because you need to understand the gravity of what the lunatic left is now asserting. They're insisting that they no longer accept the results of elections unless the elections go their way. There is another way the lunatic left essentially declares that they are abandoning democratic processes altogether and demanding a totalitarian one-party police state like you might see in North Korea, Cuba, or communist China. Be careful what you ask for, all you liberals. Do you not want to find out what happens when you tell the entire conservative base of America that they can no longer change their representatives in government by using the ballot box? What you're doing, all of you on the delusional left, is practically begging to unleash an armed civil war that you most assuredly lose badly. Legitimacy of elections, you are summoning the demons of war to our nation. You have no idea the seriousness of your assertion that democratic election outcomes will no longer be tolerated by the left unless they result in preordained election outcomes desired by the left. Notably, if you do not believe in the outcomes of democratic elections that don't go your way, you don't believe in democracy at all. Stay tuned for the next 9 days. Let's see where the insanity of George Soros directed left-wing haters takes us. If they push this all the way to the point of treasonous coup against America's legitimate president-elect, you will likely hear many people announce a Second Amendment activation to save the republic. And yes, the entire U.S. military, law enforcement, and armed citizenry will be working in unison to defend the republic. The Second Amendment, as any historian will explain, was put into the Bill of Rights specifically to allow the citizenry a last-ditch means of self-defense against a tyrannical, corrupt government that refuses to abide by the will of the electorate. That's the whole point of it. It's not about hunting. It's not even about individual self-defense. It's about defending the republic against precisely the kind of coup now being attempted by mentally ill leftists posing as journalists. That foundational intention behind the Second Amendment is now just 9 days away from being invoked yet again to save this nation from tyranny. The second article is entitled "Washington Post Goes Full Treason, Fabricates Entire Story Falsely Claiming Trump Won Because of Russian Hacks." The Washington Post has finally committed its most desperate act of credibility suicide, publishing a blatantly false, fabricated story that now claims Russia directly interfered with the election to deliver a victory to Donald Trump. The Washington Post story does not name a single source for the accusation, and obviously fabricated story serves primarily to provide cover for a previous story the Washington Post also faked and then got caught faking. Journalism at the Washington Post, in other words, has devolved to the point where new fake stories are published to try to bolster the fabrications of old fake stories. All of them feed into paranoid delusions of the hysterical left, which has now entered the realm of clinically diagnosed mental illness when it comes to the excuses for why Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump. Next, we'll hear tinfoil hat theories that aliens or Bigfoot stole the election, no doubt. The delusional liberal media is now widely circulating the Washington Post story as fact, citing the Washington Post as their source, even though the Post cited no named person whatsoever. This is how the circle of delusion works in the bubble liberal media. One media source fabricates a piece of fake news and they all repeat it, citing each other as credible sources until the entire population of gullible Democrats believes the false narrative. Washington Post story completely bogus and they know it. Donald Trump blasted the story. These are the same people that said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, said Trump in the transition team. The election ended a long time ago in one of the biggest electoral college victories in history. It's now time to move on and make America great again. RNC spokesman Sean Spicer also lashed out at the false Washington Post fake news report by the dailycaller.com. The intelligence is wrong, Spicer told Simmerkonich. It didn't happen. We offered the New York Times conclusive proof that it didn't happen. They ignored it. They refused to look at it because it didn't fit the narrative. The Washington Post is now actively engaged in treason against the United States of America. On January 21st, 2017, one of the most important acts President Trump can initiate is the arrest and indictment of seditious Washington Post operatives who are actively working against the interests and national security of the United States of America. The wholesale fabrication of false news stories by the Post with the intended impact of denying Donald Trump the White House is an act of sedition against this nation. It means the Washington Post, far from functioning as part of the free press to keep government honest, has decided to use its remaining influence to overthrow the government through the use of strategic, falsified articles that are timed to sway electoral voters to throw their votes away from Donald Trump. In fabricating these blatant false and malicious news stories, the Washington Post is not engaged in journalism or an expression of free speech. The degree of news fakery and malicious interference with the election is ironically exactly what the Post ridiculously accuses Russia of doing. Publishing this brand of falsified information that carries such game-changing ramifications for the outcome of the Democratic election is the geographical equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded room. This is precisely the kind of deeply malicious, misleading, and knowingly false propaganda that the Trump administration must halt. The First Amendment does not protect malicious anti-American speech that is intended to overthrow the legitimately and democratically elected President of the United States. It's time to call for the arrest and prosecution of Washington Post propaganda operatives who are literally staging a soft coup via coordinated media fabrication. The Washington Post has demonstrated it is a clear and present national security threat to the United States of America. They've gone beyond their usual news fakery and have now decided to actively work against the interests of democracy. And the final article I have for you is entitled Globalist War Against Humanity Shifts into High Gear. Cars, cash, literature, and independent news all targeted for elimination. As witnessed recently by the Washington Post's horrifying dishonest journalism, naming 200 independent media websites as pawns of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the dying establishment media is desperately trying to establish a news monopoly by discrediting all competing indie news publishers. In doing so, the Washington Post and its writer Timberberg just abandoned any last vestige of journalistic credibility. Now owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, the Washington Post's willingness to prostitute its own credibility in an effort to destroy the independent media reveals something startling to the world. They're desperate. Like a cornered, ravenous animal, the mainstream media is now fighting for its very survival and hoping it can eliminate all news alternatives before the public figures out how deeply they've been lying all along. That description also applies to the globalist, nefarious manipulators of finance, technology, and culture in order to achieve their selfish aims or world domination and depopulation. Following the Brexit vote, the election of Donald Trump, and ending of Renzi regime in Italy, the globalists are in full panic mode to regain control by eliminating every sector of freedom still remaining on our planet. It's all happening right now, day by day, played out in pages on the New York Times. Here are the key areas where the globalists have declared war on humanity. Each is covered in more detail below. 1. War on cash, freedom of commerce. 2. War on automobiles, freedom of travel. 3. War on the internet, freedom of expression. 4. War on dissenting literature and news, freedom of information. Also, of course, there's the war on your health, but that topic is so enormous it'll have to be covered in a separate article. The war on cash is well underway, and the massive debt collapse is now being engineered by the globalists, will be exploited to abandon, outlaw all cash and force people into electronic currencies. Why the war on cash? Because cash offers too much freedom and anonymity to the very people the state wish to control. The electronic currency promoted by the globalists will have the following characteristics. Number 1, all transactions will be tracked by the government. It will be the end of anonymity unless you're using Bitcoin or similar cryptocurrency, all of which will, of course, be criminalized by the state. Number 2, all money can be frozen or confiscated by the government for any reason, including completely fabricated accusations such as you are working for the Russians. This gives the government absolute power to confiscate wealth, punish dissenters, put targeted commercial operations out of business, or even hand out endless currency to its crony corporate friends in Washington. Number 3, confiscate or confiscatory taxes can be automatically extracted from all your earnings, savings, and transactions without your consent or knowledge. This means governments no longer have to rely on you to report your earnings to the IRS. They can simply confiscate a percentage of your earnings and expenditures according to whatever rates and schedules they desire. Number 4, savings and deposits can be subjected to negative interest rates without causing a run on cash withdrawals. Negative interest rates are a key tactic that will be employed by globalist banksters and corrupt governments that incessantly seek new innovative ways to steal productivity from the fiscally illiterate masses. Number 5, once a government spends its way to debt oblivion, try that again. Once a government spends its way to debt oblivion, it can simply announce a massive nationwide bail-in that confiscated all the electronic currency and issues a new electronic currency worth much less, all of the click of a button. This wholesale confiscation of economic productivity from working class can keep government debt spending and money printing spinning for generations in a kind of e-currency perpetual motion machine. The New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and all the usual prostitute globalists are already pushing bans of $100 bills for this very reason. Their goal is the criminalization of cash as step 1 in their push for global totalitarian police state. As silverdoctors.com explains, negative interest rates are desperately needed by globalist bankers to thoroughly screw the world's workers out of their earnings. What's really behind this? Why is there such a big movement to ban something that's used for felonious purposes by such a, or just a fraction of a percent of the population? Cash, it turns out, is the Achilles heel of the financial system. Central banks around the world have kept interest rates at near zero levels for nearly 8 years now, and despite having created massive bubbles and enabled extraordinary amounts of debt, their policies aren't working, especially in Europe. The hope of stoking economic growth and even the sickening goal of inflation has failed. So naturally, since what they've been trying hasn't worked, their response is to continue trying the same thing and more of it. Interest rates across the European continent are now negative. Japanese interest rates are now negative. And even in the United States, the Federal Reserve has acknowledged that negative interest rates are being considered. They have no other choice. Raising rates will bankrupt the government. They support and derail any fledgling economic growth. Look at how low interest rates are in the U.S., and yet fourth quarter GDP practically ground to a halt. They simply cannot afford to raise the rates. As global economic weakness continues to play out, central banks will have no other option but to take interest rates even further into negative territory. That said, negative interest rates will be the destruction of the financial system. War on automobiles. Because an automobile allows a person to travel almost anywhere they wish without government tracking or permission, automobiles are being targeted for replacement by driverless vehicles and push for mass transit. Both driverless vehicles and mass transit systems offer governments and globalists an easy way to track the movements of individuals in society. Revisit the Tom Cruise feature film Minority Report to understand the implications of all this. It essentially means the end of personal freedom. Just this week, car manufacturer BMW managed to remotely lock a thief inside a car he was stealing, turning an automobile into a temporary prison. While we might all cheer the application of this technology to catch thieves, the far greater realization is that corrupt governments may consider any dissenting citizen to be a criminal. If you disagree with the government's position on vaccine mandates, GMO labeling, fiat currency, or terrorizing of North Dakota Native Americans to build an oil pipeline, for example, you might be designated a domestic terrorist and locked in your own vehicle by order of the state. From there, the automobile might easily be directed to transport you to an awaiting jail cell, interrogation room, or re-education camp. Don't think it couldn't happen. According to autoblog.com, they say, a newly married man discovered his BMW 550i was missing last Sunday, the day after his wedding. The man called the theft into the Seattle police, who contacted BMW. Employees at BMW's corporate headquarters were able to give the officers the exact location of the car and were able to remotely lock the 550i, trapping the suspect. This report reveals that not only can corporations and governments track the exact location of your vehicle at any moment, they can also remotely disable the vehicle or turn it into a human prison cell. Consider the implications of that the next time you're shopping for a new car that comes with remote security features. The push for mass transit, by the way, also allows governments to control citizens through security checkpoints where facial recognition systems scan thousands of faces a minute, comparing them to government database of wanted individuals. You can be placed on a wanted list just as easily as I was recently placed on a list cited by the Washington Post, ridiculously accusing me of working as propaganda operative for Vladimir Putin. The Washington Post, doubling down on its commitment to false reporting, has so far refused to retract its obvious fictional article. Such lists, in other words, can be completely fabricated out of thin air, yet cited as authoritative by any corrupt corporate or government that seeks to silence, intimidate, or eliminate political opposition. Technologies such as driverless vehicles will obviously be leveraged to control humanity, not set it free. The war on the internet. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo News, and other internet gatekeepers have declared war on the internet in an attempt to control and suppress information they don't want you to see. For years, nearly all independent media organizations, the only real free press in the Western world, have been banned from Google News and Yahoo News. Now, Google is blacklisting independent media websites from its AdSense program as a tactic to deny revenues to websites that publish information the left-leaning Google high priests don't want anyone to read. Facebook, too, has announced a new strategy to highlight hand-picked news publications such as CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, and others that knowingly, deliberately, and maliciously fabricate fake news. In doing this, Facebook has decided to diminish and suppress independent media news websites, effectively driving their visibility into the margins of public consciousness. Twitter, similarly, has already threatened to ban Donald Trump's account if he gets out of line, and Yahoo News has systematically removed nearly all conservative news websites from its index, reinforcing the liberal bubble of delusional leftist news for its already deluded followers. The aim of all this, of course, is to eliminate dissenting views altogether. It's not about winning any debate. It's about silencing those whom the left-wing tech giants disagree. This demonstrates the extreme belligerence, intolerance, and radical left. They have no tolerance whatsoever for views, opinions, or even scientific evidence that contradicts their own twisted beliefs, which are often rooted in delusional paranoia, as we've recently seen with the Russian conspiracy freakout. The war on the internet also involves turning over domain name authority to globalist info dictators. President Obama recently published Hard to Surrender the domain name authority ICANN to international control, placing it under the iron fist of China's communist leaders. This is by all design, of course. International bodies can seize domain names or shut down DNS for targeted websites completely free from domestic legal action. If these internet tyrants wish to silence a website like naturalnews.com, they simply fabricate any accusation they want. Then cite the accusation to seize the domain name by ICANN. Suddenly, the entire website gets memory hold or replaced with whatever propaganda the globalists want to push. The war on dissenting literature and news. Radical leftists and globalists don't merely want to silence opposing websites and monopolize the news. They also want to eliminate offensive books and literature from society. This effort, of course, involves all sorts of book burning initiatives disguised as inclusive or tolerance. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn book has already been targeted for elimination from human history due to its historically authentic use of racial terminology. For similar reasons, the Harper Lee book, To Kill a Mockingbird, has also been targeted for removal from libraries. The justification, as always, is that the book contains offensive content, a wishy-washy accusation rooted in astonishing ignorance. yet strongly upheld by intolerant left as justification for burning whatever books they currently find offensive. A slippery slope of totalitarian revisionist history, if there ever was one. To get a sense of where all this is headed, watch the 2002 film Equilibrium, starring Christian Bale. The film paints a remarkably authentic picture of an intolerant, militant society banning art, literature, religion, and even emotion. In essence, Equilibrium depicts what would happen if the radical left agenda of safe spaces were fast forwarded another 20 years. In that dystopian future, collectors of art and literature are condemned as enemies of the state and executed on sight. This is precisely how the radical left now view religious conservatives in America. Conclusion: the globalist war against humanity just shifted into high gear. Globalist bloodline researcher David Icke is fond of saying that even people who consider themselves to be truth seekers nevertheless have limits of what they're willing to embrace as truth. I've also found this to be quite true, and it is with that realization firmly in mind that I'm going to share with you the final endgame of all of this. It's the elimination of 90% of the human population. Globalists don't merely wish to control billions of sheeple, you see. They ultimately want to eliminate them. Totalitarian control is simply one tactic toward that aim. Right now, billions of people won't yet be eliminated because autonomous robots can't yet replace human labor. But that day is rapidly approaching, and the minute it arrives, the great culling will begin. Do you seriously think the globalist future needs low-wage, low-income, low-utility humans hanging around consuming the planet's resources and disrupting the globalist plan with ballot box votes that can't be entirely manipulated? No, the future doesn't need you at all. We are all expendable in the minds of the globalists. Globalists hold deep hatred for humanity, you see, because they despise humanity as a whole. They also hate the individual members of it. This is why they hold such animosity toward liberty, individual preparedness, and self-reliance. It's the common thread behind everything they oppose: vaccine choice, homeschooling, the Second Amendment, independent media, off-grid living, and even scientific truth. My final warning is that you are not really prepared for what's coming until you realize the globalists have declared war on humanity. You, as a free-thinking individual, are the enemy of the globalists. They are working overtime to either control you or destroy you. There's no room in their long-term plans for any individual who thinks critically and questions the status quo. The only humans they are willing to tolerate are obedient workers, and even those only for another generation or so. For now, they demand your obedience. Once they have it, they'll demand your silence as the culling begins. Before long, they'll demand your head. This is the plan they have already set into motion. The plan of monumental genocide is being meticulously set up by Google, Facebook, the Washington Post, and the truly evil destroyers of life like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and George Soros. Until you realize this, you have no chance to overcome it. Only those willing to accept the full reality of the globalist assault on humanity have a shot at defeating that demonic agenda and halting the mass genocide planned for all of us. The Holocaust of history is nothing compared to the Holocaust they have planned for humanity. Reported 6 million Jews were exterminated. Multiply that by 1,000 and you now have the scale of the next depopulation holocaust planned for us all. More than 6 billion people are scheduled to be exterminated, and they surely don't want those who are on the schedule to be exterminated figuring out all of this before the culling begins. I strongly urge everyone who has listened to this to give it a thumbs up and share the dickens out of it. Find every site that you can put this on and get this information out there. People need to know what's going on.